Okay, thank you all. We're going to get started now with this next session. I want to welcome you to a discussion about cities and how to enhance the capacity for them with respect to sustainability and resilience. The formal title is Knowledge for Sustainable and Resilient Cities in Times of Climate Change, Latest Findings and Persisting Needs. My name is Bill Selecki from the City University of New York, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have an elite group of panelists, some virtual and some on stage with us. As you probably know, there have been a number of different assessments, particularly IPCC, but other derivative products on the significance of cities with respect to climate change and the capacities that they will provide in defining solution spaces. And the panelists today will be speaking about those issues, trying to sort of bring forward what are the latest findings, but also sort of reflecting on what specific things can be introduced into the policy arena, both at the local level and at the national level. We'll look first at the global scale. We have two live panelists here who will be speaking about that, and then three specific examples in regional local contexts will sort of fill out the discussion. We'll proceed with the presentations, generally short, and then we'll have a little bit of Q&A between the panelists if specific issues come up, and then we'll also take questions from the audience. I think I just want to start with the recognition. Of course, you all here, you probably all recognize the critical role that cities will play. We are on an urban planet, and ever increasingly so, that much of the population growth that we'll see up through 2050 will be in cities. Much of that will be in small and medium-sized cities and low and moderate income cities. So that means that there's a real opportunity to sort of understand what things could be integrated from these assessments into that development process, but we also recognize that all cities, wherever they are in the constant state of rebuilding, reconstruction, and becoming. And so the idea is, how do we implement this cutting-edge knowledge into that process as well? So that's really the objective of the conversation today. So I'll just do a very brief intro with each of the panelists, not to go too much into it, and then each one will present for slightly different periods of time. First up, we have Matthias Garschhagen from the University of Munich, really a geography professor, but also sort of looking at a range of different questions in the context of cities and climate change, and most recently a lead author on several IPCC reports, and so he brings forward those perspectives here with us today. So it's a great honor to have him say a few words. So he'll say for about 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next. Matthias.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for all the listeners here in the room as well as virtually. I've been asked to give a little bit of an overview of key findings of the latest assessments by the IPCC with respect to urban risk, also urban adaptation, in order to explore a little bit of what is up there for cities, what do cities have to expect, and how can we increase their resilience. And I'm trying to do this along three, if that moves forward, along three key questions. That is not moving forward. Can somebody with the technology department maybe move the slides forward? No, here we go, thanks. Okay, I'll do this along three key messages. I'll show a little bit how cities will be faced with a steep rise in climate hazards, different one in different regions. We'll then talk a little bit about the fact that even though climate hazards are rising, future risk trends in cities also strongly depend on short and midterm changes in vulnerability and exposure, a key point to understand for adaptation also. And then thirdly, we'll talk about urban adaptation policy in action and how that has been risen, but also what are the remaining gaps that we still see and that need to be tackled in moving forward. So let's go to the first issue here. Cities will be faced with a rise in climate hazards, of course, and that is a rise in frequency and in intensity, and in the spread also of extreme events in particular. I'll show a couple of images to that end. All world regions have different effects that they will be seeing in different combinations. In many respects, and that's I think very important when we talk about adaptation later on, these are unprecedented changes, and so also that means, and the assessment shows that very clearly, that existing risk management paradigms and measures will need to be revisited in many parts of the world. And what's also very clear, every bit of warming really matters when we look into the risk and the rise of risk and also the adaptive capacity later on. So 2 examples here. I show you, first of all, a figure that some of you might have seen. It's from the SPM of the Working Group 1, actually, and it shows you heat temperature extremes, and on the right-hand side, heavy precipitation extremes. And I think quite nicely it shows the comparison of what happens to extreme events that we used to see once in 10 years. These are already 2 to 2.8 times more likely in terms of heat extremes, and these are of course very important for cities. Let's think about them, the heat waves that had strong impacts also on the cities globally over the past years, and that will go further. If you think about a 4-degree world, then what used to be a 1 in a 10-year event will actually be a 9 in 10-year event, and the extremity or the intensity will also go up by quite a strong percentage point there on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, a quite similar picture when we look into heavy precipitation. The figure works similarly, so you see also here the frequency really going up and the intensity of those events going up. And that has implications for cities, of course. First of all, these are averages, and for cities themselves, we see that some of those extremes actually rise even more strongly, because let's think about urban heat island effects, for instance. Cities actually produce and co-produce some of those hazards. But it also means that risk management actually really needs to be changed, particularly when we look into these intensity increases down there. I think Göran and others will also talk about this later on. A second, I think, quite important example is in the field of sea level rise, and that figure might be a little bit too small for the people in the room. I'll quickly talk you through. That's taken from the SROC report, and it really talks about coastal extreme water levels. So coastal storm surges, for instance. And it talks about the shift that we will see between what used to be a 1 in a 100-year event into a 1 in a year event. So in many parts of the world, actually, coastal protection, for instance, is really tuned towards a once in a 100-year event, and that will change. We will see that change happening to a once in to a yearly event, which is really quite a challenge for coastal urban adaptation. And you see here a comparison between an RCP 8.5 scenario, that's the top map, and an RCP 2.6 scenario. And the darker the color, the sooner that really fundamental transition from a 100-year event to a yearly event will have happened. And you see that in many parts, in many coastal cities also, in many parts of the world, particularly in the tropics and subtropics, that will have happened long before the middle of the century, even in a low emission scenario. So even if we were to manage emissions better, that is a really drastic and urgent need for adaptation, of course, right there. So let's move on to the second point here. Exposure and vulnerability trends matter, even though the hazard trends are very important in climate risk. Also the trends in exposure and vulnerability really matter. Let's think back towards the core risk sort of framing that was developed in the IPCC a couple of years ago in the last assessment cycle, where really we see the risk and disaster risk also for cities as the interplay of hazards, and then exposure, critical infrastructure, normal residential infrastructure, social infrastructure being in harm's way, and the vulnerability of that infrastructure, which also varies quite a great deal. And what this assessment cycle has really shown, whereas in previous assessment cycles we've really focused a lot, almost exclusively on future trends and hazards, in this assessment cycle, based on younger literature, we were also really able to show future trends in exposure and future trends in vulnerability and assessments on those. And I think that's very important to understand and leads us to a couple of key conclusions, just a couple of key high-level findings in that respect. I think that first one is really important here. It says it's taken right from the SPM. In the near term, climate-associated risks to natural and human systems depend more strongly on changes in their vulnerability and exposure than on differences in climate hazards between emission scenarios. So whilst in the long term, of course, the differences in emission scenarios matter a great deal, for the short term, it's really about limiting the further increase of vulnerability and exposure, and we need to talk about how that can be done in cities. Secondly, a second key finding, and I'm selecting here a little bit, globally urban key infrastructure systems are increasingly sites of risk creation that potentially drive compounding and cascading risks, particularly in cities, maybe particularly in coastal cities. So cities drive their own risk, if you wish. And lastly, unplanned rapid urbanization is a major driver of those risks, particularly where increasing climate-driven risks affect key infrastructure and potentially result in compounding and cascading hazards and risks, and also the spread of cities into coastal areas and other areas of high exposure. And we see that happening globally. We can come back to that in the discussion. Last point then, we looked really into adaptation also, and what do we know on adaptation? Quite new in this assessment cycle in comparison to the previous assessment cycle, simply because adaptation is taking off and so much new literature and scientific assessment is coming forward that is trying to understand how that adaptation is happening and is going. Maybe I'll highlight here just 5, I think for this event here, 5 key findings of the recent assessment report. Many cities, or many more cities, have developed adaptation plans, so that's very positive. Cities are moving forward. In terms of policy making, in terms of action, cities are actually really moving with quite a speed forward. But a limited number of these have been implemented. So we now have to turn what is on paper into action, and that's really the challenge of the future. Many of these plans also focus quite narrowly on climate risk reduction, missing the opportunity to advance co-benefits of climate mitigation and sustainable development, compounding inequity and reducing well-being. And I think particularly the inequity issue we will need to come back to. So are current risk management regimes in cities too narrow, too reactive is the question here? Do they miss opportunities for wider transitions towards sustainability? At the same time, advances have been made in adaptation measures, and there is an increasing array of options available. And also, I'll show that in a second, in the assessment report, we have an increasingly detailed assessment of the feasibility, of the acceptance and so forth of these options. So more knowledge is coming forward, but there is gaps that remain. And here I think quite an interesting one also for this event, also for the sort of the other presentations that follow later, is that the greatest gap we assessed to be there between policy and action are in failures to manage adaptation of social infrastructure, community facilities, services, networks, hospitals, and so forth, and failure to address complex interconnected risks, for example, in the food, energy, water, health nexus. So, whilst there is an increasing amount of adaptation planning, it really misses to focus on social vulnerabilities, social infrastructure that could reduce social vulnerabilities, and on complex risks. And last point here, what are the barriers for that? There is a couple of barriers. Barriers to implementing the plans are, in particular, lack of political will and management capacity, limit financial means, a big issue here this week, and in some other issues also competing priorities. Just to illustrate these points clearly or quickly, I don't want to go through the figures, just to highlight here, if you're interested in that, there is a very good figure in the Working Group 2, Chapter 6, which really looks into adaptation gaps. And it compares here, always in the top bar, how well is adaptation going currently for the richest 20% in a city, and then below that for the lowest, for the poorest 20% in a city. And we see quite clearly across different regions and across different adaptation domains to different hazards, the adaptation gaps are really the strongest with the poorest. So we need to talk about that equity and inequity issue here. We then also assessed, I mentioned it, the feasibility of adaptation options, just a signpost here I'm not going to go through. You'll find that in also the summary for urban policymaker, which just has been launched last week in figure number 6. And just to conclude, what does all of that mean? It means basically we need to start moving forward. Also for urban adaptation, time is running out, but we need to do it in a smart way. We need to plan with adaptation planning and adaptive planning so that we can change course. Also, this is quite in more detail discussed in the report, but we need to get going. These things have startup times, political processes, participation processes, and so forth. So that needs to happen, and I think we'll come back to that in the discussion also. Thanks for that.
Great, thanks so much. So you got a very quick sense of the tremendous amount of new knowledge that's come out of these assessment reports. Of course, all of this is available for download and available to you. You know, thinking of some of the words that were brought forward, particularly in terms of adaptation that Matthias just presented, implementation, narrowness, measures, gaps, etc. So it's this idea of how to bring this knowledge to bear on the pressing questions. And then our next speaker really has, honed in on that question specifically. And I can't think of anyone really better to speak about that connection between the science and the policy-making arena, the practitioner. Seth Schultz will speak for a few minutes about the new summary for policymakers. He's also the CEO of Resilience Rising and has had a long history of connecting science to policy. So Seth, please.
Thank you, Bill. It's great to be here. It's actually really great that I get to go after what we just heard from Matthias on an overview of all the stuff on the summary for urban policymakers, but particularly honing in on a few points that he made, particularly around getting humans and individuals involved in this. So to what I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit is the summary for urban policymakers that Bill Selecki just mentioned that was launched last week. Bill and a number of other people in this room were involved in that. But really this was born out of a primary issue to recognize and understand that for science to reach its fullest potential, it needs to be accessible and it needs to be understandable. Nobody had any idea that it would take roughly 25, 30 years to get the world to come to an agreement on climate agreement, which happened in the Paris Agreement. The IPCC was created to provide guidance to national governments in creating that international treaty. It has a very specific mandate to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. Because the scientists aren't supposed to tell the countries what to do. They're supposed to advise them on what to do. But what's really interesting is after the Paris Agreement was reached, IPCC has become the world's most prestigious, robust, peer-reviewed body of scientists in the world on any topic, hands down. And the work that they're doing is absolutely essential because as more and more of this information and knowledge is generated, which we're doing rapidly and part of what you just heard, it becomes denser and denser and thicker. So what we did at the very heart of the summary for urban policymakers is we took roughly, I think there's 11,000 pages in the 3 AR6 volumes, and we distilled that down to 50 pages. And we did it for one key community of practice, policymakers in cities. You heard in the beginning Bill talking about the issues swirling around and us living in a largely urbanized world. If we don't get that right, and if we don't tackle that, it's not going to work. So it wasn't very hard to come to the conclusion that we needed a simpler mechanism with which to distill this information, relate it in a language that was understandable and accessible to the policymakers, to then provide a much more meaningful mechanism of engagement and implementation to them. So we experimented in this a little bit after the after the special report on 1.5 degrees. It was this first special report in this AR6 cycle. And that was a really unique process because it's the first time, again, in the 30-year history of the IPCC that all 3 working groups worked together to generate that. So now back into the AR6 cycle, it's divided into kind of these 8 working group 1, 2, and 3 scientific groups. So what we did for the summary is we kind of mimicked what we've learned from 30 years of the IPCC, and we utilized each of the working group scientists. So we had scientists from each of them, a total of 60 scientists across all working group 1, 2, and 3 to work on this. Plus, we engaged with 50 cities around the world and 26 multinational companies. So we were really experimenting on the code generation side of this. If we want to make this translatable, we need to have that group at the table, i.e. cities, so we could understand the language, understand the issues, and build that around their needs. And at the same time, what we did around this series of projects, as I just mentioned, is brought in the private sector, which we hadn't done for the 1.5. And it was fascinating because the desire and the interest to be at the table, to be heard, to listen to each other, and to collaborate was fascinating. But also the people we work together with, they've been all working, they're experts in their own right, in their own fields on climate, and have been doing it for decades. But getting all 3 of these different communities of practice, scientists, city policymakers, and businesses, sitting down and actually talking about it was remarkable because they use different words, or in some cases they use the same word that has a different meaning. They have different priorities, but it was an explosion of creativity and collaboration. And I think what I'm excited about is potentially landing on a new COP for the 21st century, right? So COP stands for the Conference of Parties, and it's specific for national governments and exclusive to them. I think what we need to do for the 21st century to tackle a lot of the issues Mateus just mentioned and highlighted is communities of practice that need to come together to implement this. And that's a new type of COP, communities of practice. So it's really exciting. We had the support of all 6 working group co-chairs as well as the vice chairs, all in a voluntary capacity on the delivery of this. And aside from these groups, what we did is we actually held 6 different regional convenings and 4 global. Because part of the trick here, and if we want to get down into specificity of implementation, it must be local, right? So how do you think global and act local? So we're trying to translate the science to a key community of practice, crowdsource in the perspectives and knowledge of other groups, while at the same time getting specific. And we did this by these regional convenings. And that was phenomenal because as we went around the world with these different kind of clusters of conversations regionally, as you will not be surprised, you heard different priorities, different issues come forward in that. As one example, when we were in Africa, one of the things that came very loud and clear through the African meeting is they need more science-generated opportunities and mechanisms in Africa. So stop exporting global north practices and or sciences to us. We need to build a capacity to develop the scientific expertise in the places where they need it through their own processes and mechanisms, as an example. Again, when we did our convening in North America, we heard loud and clear from around equity and inclusivity in terms of the processes, in terms of who is accessible to the science. This was very large with regard to indigenous knowledge and indigenous communities, which is one of the forms of knowledge that the IPCC has a hard time understanding and extracting because it's not in the peer-reviewed process. I could go on and on, but what I would, instead of doing that, because we've got some other great speakers online, we want to have a discussion with all of you, I'd recommend going to the website, the Summary for Urban Policymakers. We released all 3 reports simultaneously for Working Group 1, 2, and 3. And we've also got an action agenda, the so what about that we're launching at the Multi-Level Action Pavilion right down the hall in the next building on Wednesday. And that is setting forth an action agenda for how we're going to take this forward, continue to deepen and enrich the collaboration between national governments, scientists, cities, and businesses. So hopefully you all join us for that and continue to support, as many of you are in this room and online, have been supporting this work all along. Thanks, Bill.
Great, thanks, Seth. So that, I mean, again, sort of just so much going on in this space, and just to note that event on Wednesday again, to sort of for folks to continue the conversation. But there are a couple of words that I think Seth brought up, which we're going to echo again in the next section of talks: communities of practice and sort of local expertise. And I think one of the things we all recognize is that there is so much going on at the local level, so many projects, so much expertise, and how do we sort of understand the value of that and bring those examples forward? And we're going to have 3 examples of that just coming up right now. First up, we'll have Jorn Berkman at the University of Stuttgart. Jorn also is a recent IPCC author and has really done a lot of work looking at the connection between vulnerability and adaptation in a variety of different contexts. So we'll have the 3 presenters. We're going to cross our fingers and go virtual. I see them on screen, so I think that means that they'll be able to hear you, or at least you'll be able to hear them. So Jorn, you first, and then we'll have the others come on. But please.
Yes, thank you very much, Bill. I cross also my fingers. Hopefully we don't have to crucify ourselves. Here you see, I mean, thank you first of all for the opportunity to give a talk also here in this quite interesting and innovative event. I would try to shift a bit the focus. What Matthias said, definitely we are seeing more and more extreme events. And the question is a little bit, what happened if a country would have the funding for compensating loss and damages? Would we go into a more climate resilient development pathway? And I try to outline it a little bit along the R-Valley project, or the R-Valley, because this valley was hit heavily by a heavy precipitation event in summer 2021. And actually what we are seeing here is that, for example, major destruction took place, and about 140 people actually were killed. Normally, you would assume that this could not happen in Germany, where we normally expect that an early warning system would warn you. Actually, the warning was not issued, and also the electricity broke down. And here, I think it's also important, again, to recognize what we have assessed in the IPCC report a bit. As Matthias also pointed out, we have to look into climate change and this physical phenomena and changes, but we have also to better understand the unsustainable use of resources, land, and particular patterns of urbanization that might actually increase exposure and vulnerability. And these kind of continuous or parallel trends actually emerge to or bring us towards risk levels. What is interesting, if you look closer at this photo, you can discuss whether the car could be found in Egypt or in the United States. But if you look just at the building, it's actually quite new. And you see a lighter brown and a darker brown. You see how high the water went. So it fully covered the first floor, not only the basement. And here this family was quite lucky because they could evacuate under the roof. But a lot of people died actually under the roof because the building was not high enough. And here again, the question is also actually for urban policies. To what extent have we considered that when we issued building permits? Another, I think, challenge is, on the one hand, we have to deal with more extreme events and more intense events, and the R-Valley heavy precipitation could have come down in Bonn, and most likely then Bonn would have faced at least also very severe challenges. So it was to a certain extent by accident that this heavy precipitation event occurred in the Ahr Valley. What is positive, we have the state and the federal government, and here I would be a bit more cautious with the local capacities. They actually initiated a reconstruction fund of 30 billion euros, which is a quite significant amount considering that these are more medium and small cities along the Ahr. However, the question is ongoing, to what extent does this funding allow actually for resilience building and climate change adaptation? Or what is actually our understanding of reconstruction? Is this mainly the compensation of loss and damage, and you rebuild what has been proven to be vulnerable? And I would like to outline this a little bit with some examples here. I mean, on the one hand, we observe very different phases of reconstruction. Individual reconstruction, quite a lot of voluntary work and voluntary support was provided, which is on the one hand great. On the other hand, this also has led to a certain extent to the re-establishment of existing structures or structures that existed there before. We are seeing also to a certain extent in some cities out-migration, actually like similar to Hurricane Katrina. But this also poses a lot of challenges because you cannot access directly the land. You're not sure to what extent some cities will be rebuilt and others might have significant shortages of population. Oil heating was, for example, an issue. We often have the feeling that insurance help us, but here insurance, for example, mainly paid for the same heating system. But luckily the state government, for example, said we should actually change this, and then oil heating systems were actually modified, and funding was provided for alternative energy use in a building because this oil also contaminated a lot of buildings. And last but not least, you see here bridge. And this is also quite an interesting point because on the one hand, it's quite clear that the bridge was a kind of barrier for a lot of wood, and the wave, for example, increased by around 2 meters. Once the bridge broke, 2 meters high flood wave went down the Ahr Valley. On the other hand, this is a kind of local heritage. So to what extent do we preserve local heritage, and to what extent are we actually providing new standards? So this is a very current question and still not yet finally answered. Last but not least, also, if we talk about formal urban planning, I mean, we can definitely try to translate important key findings of the IPCC to urban policymaker. That's good. But what happens in urban planning? I mean, it's legally binding regulations. It's not just a plan or a kind of map which has nice colors, but you often define so-called construction zones and non-construction area. And here, for example, you see in the picture that the blue line was a former demarcation of the HQ 100 line, so the area that normally differentiates areas where you can build new structures, new buildings, and so those areas that you're not allowed to do so. The red line is actual flood line, and here, for example, we have to deal with changing regulations, changing flood zones, and that's quite a tricky business for the insurance industry on the one hand, but also for urban planning, because you want to have legally binding conditions, not only for 10 years, but if you allow a person to build a house for 500 euros or 500,000 US dollars, you cannot somehow demolish it 5 years later. So here you see in the photo also an area that looks quite like you have a space in front of the river. But this, for example, open space was normally fully covered by buildings, and the gray, for example, shading of the house you're seeing indicates that there was a house before directly next to the other house. So here, for example, the reconstruction is an open issue. On the one hand, there's a no construction zone that has to be taken into consideration. But if your house is partially damaged, you don't need a building permit. You can just rebuild it, even if it's in the wrong location. And here we're seeing a lot of new challenges, I would say, that have not been answered. Even if we have more information, we have to ask ourselves, to what extent is our regulation or our conventional planning system actually in the position to consider these kind of things? In addition, I think what Matthias also outlined, we deal with a lot of questions around, for example, sensitive or critical infrastructures. And here, for example, schools for people with disabilities or an elderly home was washed away actually downstreams hours after the first part of the flood was has occurred upstream. And the question is a bit, to what extent are we in the position to rebuild it in a more resilient manner? On the one hand, actually, that depends on the concepts available. Here we would need the urban or the translation to urban policymakers, but also the funding regulations. If you mainly get funding for the compensation of actual losses, also doesn't matter whether it's in Africa or here in Germany, you face a problem then that the innovations are not paid for. So here the modification of actual infrastructures is an important part that needs to be integrated. And also I think the individual support and the speed and scale of cooperation. So For example, in terms of flooding, heavy precipitation, it's not sufficient if we mainly look at the local level. We have to look into the entire watershed and ask ourselves, how much more money do you get if you cooperate with your neighboring community? In most cases, actually, what we're seeing around the world, there's no additional funding or not a higher funding rate if you cooperate with the neighboring community. This leads me to the last slide, or finally last slide. I think here, on the one hand, we have the opportunity to potentially modify things directly after the disaster, but also actually 1 year after the heavy precipitation and flood event. In the Ahr Valley, we see a lot of changes that still could be implemented. If you talk about public infrastructure, if you talk about sensitive infrastructures like schools, kindergartens, if you talk about hospitals, they are not rebuilt yet. And here the reconstruction funds available would make potentially quite a difference if then criteria for resilience building would be considered. This brings me to the conclusion. On the one hand, successful reconstruction and recovery after extreme events is an important opportunity, and they depend definitely on technology and finance. However, not only, because it also depends on the extent to which development strategies take into account issues of equity, cooperation, and climate resilience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jorn. So I think one of the things that we started this conversation is that the standard narrative on cities is they provide an opportunity for action, for defining solution space. So what Jorn has just sort of brought forward is a very specific example of where those opportunities might lie in the unfortunate situation of the post-event reconstruction. How do we sort of, take best advantage of those moments? And I think our next speaker, Jörg Nürnig, apologies if I butchered that a little bit, I'm sorry, will sort of speak to that issue in the context of smart cities and technology. He's a professor at Hafen City University at Hamburg, and is going to speak specifically about some insights from BMBF priority funding program, sustainable development of urban regions. And I think he'll sort of talk about this question of methods and approaches and technologies and how this might help. So please, Jörg.
Yeah, thank you very much, and a warm hello and good afternoon to everybody online and on site in the audience. It's my pleasure to report on the BMBF funding priority called SURE. Within the Research for Sustainability strategy, the German Ministry of Education and Research has recognized and acknowledged that sustainability and resilience of cities and urban regions is a priority task. It has set up quite a great number of initiatives, of projects, some of them we have seen already. So there's a vast research landscape on the issues at hand. And in order to follow and establish a systematic approach that on the one hand takes into consideration the risks, the hazards, the challenges in the urban region context, on the other hand to orchestrate the multiple endeavors and the multiple approaches to urban resilience research, sustainability research, it has established the program called SURE. SURE stands for Sustainable Development of Urban Regions. And I would like to report to you a little bit about this package actually of projects within that funding priority. To give you some numbers, so I am representing the synthesis research project, so the synthesis and facilitation of transfer communication and the synergies within 10 individual projects that are running already since a couple of years. They are in their research and development phase. And these 10 projects, in fact, involve 147 different institutions that are involved as research partners and as implementation partners on site. And on site, that means 8 different countries in Southeast Asia, on which laboratories, living labs, settings are going on, where the partnerships, the research and the implementation partnerships are established. And altogether, these 10 projects, 10 plus 1 project, invest 28 million euro in order to bring things to the ground to really create an impact in sustainable urbanism. Who is SURE? Here you can see not only the phases, but I will give you a short run through the 10 projects within the SURE project. So we have buildings, we have projects that target sustainable buildings. We have projects that take into consideration water management. We have projects that deal with energy efficiency, with waste management, green city, green infrastructures, and the urban-rural nexus. So as you can see, this is quite a colorful package, quite an extensive package of projects. And the partners, as already indicated, come from a variety of backgrounds, from geographical backgrounds. Here you see the partners by country sorted, but the partners also come from totally different types of institutions. Of course, the research institutions within the research priority funding are the majority, but we have the governances, the local and regional governance institutions involved. We have international organizations involved, the third sector, and the citizen society organizations. These projects and their networks, they are active here in this geographical range, so ranging from China in the north to Indonesia in the south, from Philippines in the east to Myanmar in the west. And all these projects are well underway, and we have visited them, we are talking with them, we are running workshops with them in order to learn and to foster and to qualify the knowledge that is being produced in them. And this is the perspective of the synthesis and transfer research. So this is the task that I and my colleagues are responsible for. The task is a threefold one. So first of all, we have to look into these different projects and dig up the different sources of information, of data, and the insights that are gathered in these projects. We have to make sure that the knowledge is not only there and presented, but that it travels further so that it is communicated and exchanged, not only between the projects, but also to the stakeholders beyond the scientists, beyond academia. And we have to make sure, and we try to find ways and tools and means to enable a strong impact, so that impact is generated that really works towards the sustainability goals. So we can look into the documents, the text, the exchanges, the communication that is happening in these projects. From doing so, we create emergent compasses of topics, of themes, the topics and themes that are relevant right now, but also the topics and the themes and the key points that may become relevant in the near future. We try to establish paths between the projects and beyond the projects by, for instance, connecting the projects themselves with the topics they are working on in the regions and the localities that they are addressing, so that we can find out where the knowledge is, that we know where the knowledgeable stakeholders, where the knowledgeable researchers and the communities can be contacted. And finally, we want to establish, and we are on the way towards that goal, to create a model that we can monitor, that we can estimate the impact that these activities and these projects are creating, long-term impact that allows us to assess on the way while the projects are going on, whether they really contribute to the local and the global sustainability goals. Doing the impact monitoring, collecting all the knowledge, we want to become actionable. We want to give advices and hints how to carry out certain tasks, how to address certain important questions. Here you can see some of these questions that we have modeled, that we have shaped from the ongoing discussions, from the experiences and the insights of the individual projects in Southeast Asia. And the answers and the solutions that we may find and that we are shaping at the moment, we want to put on a knowledge base, a knowledge bank that is open, that is globally accessible, that is digital. But we also want to play the regular ways of communication, the regular ways of distribution and dissemination by, for instance, issuing a solutions magazine that compiles and comprises all the valuable findings from the SURE funding priority. Being a work in progress, 3 takeaways, which at the same time are also tasks to tackle further on. In terms of synthesis, we hold that the research needs to lead to connected knowledges, knowledge in plural format, so that we can create access point that acknowledges the diversity of backgrounds, the truths that each of the projects and contexts brings with it, but makes it accessible from one place. So the digital knowledge base may be such a single source of truth. In terms of transfer, we have to make sure that the knowledge is not only academic or theoretical, bringing knowledge into local action to ignite and to lead behavior change with the local communities is one of the strongest tasks to address. But we have that issue on our radar, and we are collecting already practices how to do that. And in terms of implementation, we have to ask ourselves, what do we implement? Do we just implement projects? Do we have short-term goals, or do we implement infrastructures that live beyond the projects, that have a longer life, that have a long-term resilience even after a project or a funding priority has finished? This is the perspective that we are taking with the SURE funding priority, and that the individual projects within the SURE funding priority share with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So you saw a great example there of a highly integrated, global project, really addressing some of the themes that we've heard, like the necessary research gaps. We're going to hear a little bit more, one more presentation, and then we'll open it up for some questions either amongst the panelists or through the audience as well. We'll have Professor Frauke Kraus, Chair of the Urban and Social Geography Department in the Institute of Geography at University of Cologne. Haven't seen her in a long time, so it's great to see you. And she's going to be speaking more specifically about some of the multiple risk management issues in Southeast Asia. So please, Frauke.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bill, everyone. I will in the following summarize key findings of several projects which look into multiple risk management of extreme events in fast-growing megacities in Southeast Asia. Although I would not like to go to key studies, but I would like to rather summarize our findings, and I would look into 2 research gaps which are so evident, or which have been proven to be so evident, plus the fact that they have hardly been dealt with. Therefore, I would like to highlight them. So first of all, different disasters, different events which we have to see, which we are seeing in Southeast Asia. I think everyone is aware about the fact that these urban areas mostly are concentrated in coastal areas, deltas, along fault lines, and we are all aware that risks are not evenly distributed in space, so cities are especially risk-prone areas. The effects of geofactors and also geo-events culminate in cities. We have a clear demand for specific action in spatial planning, including all kinds of measures. Many hazards start at certain points and diffuse further. Thus, what we are experiencing is more and more we find multiple cascading risks in urban areas. In particular, this cascading effect becomes clear the more we look into how processes are evolving. These hazards change, at least temporarily or partly permanently, structures, functions, and processes. And what is very evident, at least for Southeast Asia, I can't speak for other areas, is that social infrastructures are heavily neglected. On top, whatever happens, we find migration processes, decay, production losses, even neighborhood effects are usually neglected. So disasters are culminations in systems, complex circumstances convene. So in cities and megacities, we find multiple and growingly cascading risks. So we have a number of examples where they are earthquake prone. There are earthquakes, floods, tropical cyclones, and then all these smaller ones like fires, dump site fires, vector-borne diseases, seasonally ones like chikungunya, dengue, etc. Recently, of course, COVID pandemic. And then on top, political challenges, I won't name them explicitly, but a number of challenges which come on top, be it regime changes, be it on local or regional level, really clear political challenges which are hindering to deal with different kind of multiple and growingly cascading risks. I would like to focus on two research gaps in the following. The one is, in our work, we found that particularly system-relevant small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs or SSMEs, as well as civil societies, including all their different institutions, very local at part, including volunteer systems, they are usually neglected and they are usually not included in multiple risk management systems. So to summarize key findings and research gaps, the most affected areas are usually land reclamation areas in urban areas, peripheral sites, marginal and slum populations. The loss of property is partly enormous. There are enormous deficits in immediate health services, let alone people who can really access health services. Mostly they rely on public health, while in Southeast Asia, many of the health functions are in private hospitals. Second, what is evident is that there is an urgent need to deal with the first 72 hours, which usually cannot be coped with by administrations, government, but the military, disaster relief units. Thus, we found that there is a decisive role of private sector SMEs and the civil society institutions, as well as different levels of interconnectedness. Third, the role of the private sector. This one is taking part. This is taking over large parts of relief action for employees, for instance, donations for the urban poor. So there's a lot of informality from above, functioning local patronage systems, and again, predominantly SMEs helping to cope situations, particularly in these first 72 hours. Fourth, and I don't name the different examples explicitly, but I could give proofs, of course, neighborhood and family support are most effective. They are quick in supporting, they are quick in responding, they have the capacity to react flexibly on uncertain, flexibly, but the uncertainty is very high. They have the local knowledge to handle, for instance, sudden monsoonal events or whatever events they may be. So we need a risk assessment for system-relevant SMEs. We need to define them. We need to develop strategies, auditing concepts to improve their preparedness. And we need case and pilot studies which prove to really work. B, we need system-relevant civil society institutions to understand, for instance, how to make evacuation concepts work, to evaluate their resilience against these multiple and cascading risks, to develop scenario-based evacuation concepts, and to develop auditing guidelines. As it comes to SMEs, their importance and vulnerability to risk can hardly be overestimated. They have a vital role in supporting economic growth in general, as mostly about up to 99% of the firms in developing countries are SMEs. They are contributing enormously to GDP. The amount of employment is clear. The high level, but they have a low level of disaster perception, preparedness, and reduction policy. The higher losses are usually in the formal sector. I think Matthias made that very clear earlier already. Nonetheless, they are most affected in case of hazards. They have the shortest of risk analysis, so they don't really know how to handle that. They are usually falling out of the complexity of post-disaster recovery. We further have an untapped role of state-led SME-oriented DRR, and we do not really know about the decision-making processes between the administration, the private sector, and the institutions. When we look into civil society, the knowledge, the training, awareness, and preparedness, It's evident in our studies that the exposure is highly different, but we lack data and knowledge in detail. So they are very differently exposed. Usually, this exposure is not even known to governments, to administrations, let alone experts. The educational level of people is enormously different. So the households with low education and mostly low income, they have hardly any knowledge, let alone financial strength. So in our studies, we've proven that less than 10% of the lower education levels are prepared. The interest of the people is not given. So they have hardly any sense, let alone time, to attend training courses. Their minds they are completely oriented to managing daily lives. So how can they be included? Number of training courses, they differ depending on the level of NGOs, depending on the level of courses which are prepared or given by cities, townships, and neighborhoods. And we do have very unknown volunteer systems. They differ a lot between cities, townships, and neighborhoods. To summarize, the social infrastructure is neglected, rarely known, rarely included. And the question is whether this is, and for Southeast Asia, I can speak clearly to that. Often it's a question of political will. What we do need are complex, adaptive system approaches to include multiple cascading urban risks. There are different levels, the stakeholders, particular from the SME side as well as civil society side. So to summarize the points, in my view, we need to look far deeper into multiple and cascading risks in urban areas, to develop adequate multiple risk management systems, including the gaps of SMEs and civil society. And we need to better address particularly the low preparedness and adaptation levels of SMEs and the civil society to close the important gaps. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Frauke. So we've heard so much over the last little less than an hour. We've gone a world tour of some of the issues. And I think, we all recognize that it is sort of a golden age of urban research in terms of these connections between cities and climate change. And I think one of the things we also have to keep in mind, of course, is that the IPCC has recognized there will be a special report on urban issues in the next cycle. So, some of the discussions that we can have and some of the presentations we've had sort of speak to those issues. What I'd like to do, I know we've lost a few folks along the way, so it's the hardcore that are left in the process and the discussion. Maybe open it up to see if the audience has any specific questions, but also to sort of pick up points of departure that we've heard already. So I want to put it out to the audience. I'm not sure how they would. We have, I think, a person with a trusty mic available. Are there any immediate questions? We've heard a lot of material. Was that a question, sir, or just a fly swat there? You have a question? Okay. And you could address it to any individual person or the panelists, however you see fit.
Thank you very much. My name is Francois Mengele. I work for GIZ here in Egypt, responsible for the portfolio of urban projects that deal with environment, waste management, water, and so on. I do have two questions. The first presenter, I think Matthias, you mentioned that there is some level of, let's say, there is an increasing adaptability in the cities. I was questioning myself, what cities are you referring to when you rate adaptability as being on a progressive path? For someone who is in Egypt, a country that is building 20 cities at the same time, this is a question. The second question is, listening to all the presentations so far, I keep asking myself as an urban planner, maybe we are not commodifying the profession enough, making it less complicated and less sophisticated to be accessible only for the, for a certain class or a certain elite. I think there is some indigenous knowledge that is being applied in the context of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on, that we are not using it enough to kind of infuse in our planning schools, the level of resilience that really exists in those communities to make urban planning less sophisticated, but readily accessible to the communities. So those are my two concerns.
Okay, I was going to introduce that word accessibility, but you did. It was great. Those are great questions. So maybe Matthias is up first, and then we can spin it through the group to respond to the other point.
Yeah, thanks. Great and important questions indeed. To the first question, I mean, what I try to say is we observe that there is increasing activity in terms of adaptation planning and adaptation policy making. Whether that actually really leads to increased capacity to also do the right action from that is precisely the question. So we can just observe there is more adaptation plans, there's more climate action plans in cities and so forth. But we also observe, as I've said, that many of those are not implemented currently. So why is that? And that's maybe what we still have to learn a little bit more also towards the next towards the next report. So there is these barriers, the literature is coming up on those, but why is it that things happen on paper and maybe moving into the right direction, but then action falls short of that? I think that's a key thing. So I would actually agree to your observations there also.
Can I push you a little bit?
Sure. Go ahead.
I interpreted your question saying that Matthias inferred this idea of flexibility and adaptability. You don't see that in your work, or you say that's a huge challenge.
I think it still remains a huge challenge.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if you addressed that specifically.
Okay, then I can, but I think we can. So the knowledge on that is still limited. But from what we see in a big overview that we did on the academic literature, increasingly also grey literature, would be that actually cities have a very hard time precisely to be adaptable. And I think there's good reasons for that. It's very nice to show on paper these pathways I've shown, but in hard reality to say, do I now build a coastal protection system in cities like New York, Bill's hometown, to say let's improve or let's make our city storm-proof for the next 80 years? How do you do that in an adaptable manner? Do you first build it 20 centimeters and then another 20 centimeters later? And like Jörn also said, do you allow people first of all to build somewhere, but then later on not, if climate change is actually exceeding 3 degrees or so? So I think that is precisely the challenges where cities have a very hard time of doing it. I think what the literature would suggest from a normative level and from a sort of practical planning level is the precautionary principle is important here. If we are not very sure yet on how bad some of those risks will be, let's have some precaution and rather not build into floodplains, for instance, if we don't know if these areas will really be floodplains in the year 2080 or not. But that in real policy making is very hard, particularly in very dynamic cities, of course, where there's a lot of growth pressure and a lot of pressure to develop these areas. So I would say precisely that's a challenge. Cities have not shown a high adaptability in their planning, let's say. Yeah?
Right. Yeah, but it sort of speaks to that issue, and I'll just introduce one thing and then put it out to the other panelists. We think about climate change as the current moment, and cities are responding. But of course, we recognize that cities have these long histories that are very much sort of rooted in their understanding of where they are at the moment, and climate change is just a veneer on top of that. And it's sort of that disconnect between we need to respond to climate change, but there's this thousands of years, hundreds, actually thousands, I guess, of years of history. So how do you sort of meet these two together? So maybe someone else wants to. So the issue of adaptability and accessibility. Does anyone else want to speak to those things? I don't know. Maybe we'll give privilege to Seth, but he's sort of seemingly getting ready to speak, if that's okay, and then we'll go to the virtual folks.
Whatever order works.
Yeah.
No, I think it's a great question. I might offer a couple of ideas and suggestions from a non-peer-reviewed literature base. I think that I was going to go where Bill was going, right? So there's multiple issues, and I think when we overly assume about adaptation, which is a response to climate change, you're doing disservice to the number of issues that cities are dealing with. So in the African context, you're dealing with rapid urbanization that has some climate drivers, but also non-climate drivers. You've also got informal settlements. You've got a totally different set of issues, or an addition set of issues. Digitalization is also rapidly transforming cities in terms of how they behave. So that's all happening at the same time. And I think the way forward and the mechanism of how policymakers are doing this is that they're jumping from crisis to crisis. And when you're confronted with multiple issues happening at the same time, as a mechanism, makes you very reactive in nature. I think part of the issue that we have to do is start merging the mitigation and the adaptation/resilience agendas together. I mean, we need to start putting together a process with helps. Let's pick a project that has the highest mitigation potential that also returns the highest resilience dividend. We need to be much more strategic in what we're doing and how we're combining these issues.
Are you talking CRD or?
No, I'm actually on the planning side.
Okay.
I'm on the planning side, because when you have these slew of options and you've got 2 to 4 year political terms in terms of administration, you need to pick a few things to do them and deliver them, and you have to get the political will of those municipalities to do it. I think the second thing that we're seeing in the policy making space is that there's been, in some cases, and I've been part of this work on this hyper focus on cities, there has to be a larger regional context in play, because a lot of the adaptation and resilience opportunities are at a watershed basin level. They are at a regional level, and mostly speaking, that region has lower money, lower governance, and lower authority. So cities have the political kind of attention. They have some of the clout because it's where businesses and money and people sit, and a densification of infrastructure, but the solutions are broader than the geopolitical boundaries of the city. But there's very few regional planning associations in place. That could help with that preventative, adaptive capacity of looking ahead while also responding to the immediate crises that you're being put in front of, as well as trying to pick the ones that are going to result in the most beneficial immediate and long-term benefit.
Great. Maybe we'll go to the, I'm looking at the virtual crowd here. I know, Jorn, I inferred the issue of CRD a little bit in terms of your example from Germany, but does anyone want to pick up the issue of adaptive and accessible? Yes, Frauke has raised her hand. Go for it.
Well, first of all, I'm very happy to know that the next IPCC will be particular on cities. Absolutely overdue, and I'm happy to join. What I would like to say is, and thank you very much for that enormously relevant question that you made. Let us tap into, to tell that very clearly, first into a much easier and diversified language, second into a culturally sensitive and well-adapted way, and third, we need locally embedded and rooted measures. We need to get away from this copy-paste culture.
Great, thanks. Jorn, did you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe a short remark. I think our colleague in Egypt is pointing to some right issues. On the other hand, the GIZ was also responsible, if I'm not mistaken, for some decades for some of these issues, without criticizing GIZ here. But I think the challenge is a little bit, on the one hand, for example, also indigenous knowledge is good. But what do you do if, for example, people in the Mekong have not experienced yet major storms and they build their houses on pillars, but then the storm tracks will change further south in Vietnam? Or if you talk about significant sea level rise and the salinization trend for large parts of Alexandria and Cairo. So here, to a certain extent, I doubt that only, I mean, probably it's a combination of knowledge we need, but I would not put too much rosy glasses on indigenous knowledge only. I think that would also not work. What I'm seeing to a certain extent, the challenge is definitely the negotiation of this more expert or technical knowledge versus more local knowledge. And what Seth said, I think, is also particularly true. I think a lot of problems in many countries are also due to the fact that the solution space is not sufficiently flexible and also not considered. I mean, a lot of cities just look at their territory, take it Alexandria and the lake behind Alexandria. You just dump it and you build new structures on it, or some other cities, for example, in terms of heat stress or the fresh water sources, etc., coming all from the hinterland. And I think this is actually a global problem or a kind of global deficit. And I think this is stronger interaction. What do we pay for the surrounding municipalities that have to carry the burden of some of the functions we need for adapting cities more strategically, for example, to heat stress? And I don't think we have a solution. I mean, a lot of cities, be it in the north, be it in the global south, mainly say, okay, we probably need a technical fix on that. And then we see later on that, for example, air conditioning won't work too much if you want to enjoy the outside space. So here, I think the entire system also to how to assess or how to calculate the benefits and costs of certain adaptation measures is not yet well advanced. I mean, we traditionally also in engineering, I think, look very much at cost-benefit analysis. For a tunnel system, a bridge, a harbor, it might work, but I doubt that it would be very effective to look at this city regional interactions or city surrounding trade-offs for different adaptation measures. And I think we also have to point out, I mean, this is sometimes a bit, I think, also in the IPCC or COP thing, we often talk about the solution space, but to be honest, we probably find also some areas where there is no solution space. It's probably a kind of degradation after degradation. And this probably is also a topic we need to address to a certain extent, because structural change will come for some municipalities or cities, and we don't have potentially the resource available that would be needed. Thanks.
Great. Well, that was sort of illuminating in terms of some of the challenges. So this is we're seeing all the different sides of the prism here. So Jörg, do you want to come into this to add to this complexity?
Exactly. Also responding to the remark of the GIZ colleague, being a planner myself, I'm an untrained architect and urban designer, I would still subscribe to his statement that the planning knowledge needs to be more commodified, that we have to make urban planning and designing of cities and houses more accessible. Quite certainly, these kind of tasks need expert knowledge. So we have trained planners, more or less perhaps in the ivory tower, but the knowledge that is needed to plan buildings, to take care of your environment, of your quarter, to design it, that can be learned. And the colleague from the GIZ certainly knows that in most of these development projects, capacity building is one of the major issues. It's not only about the transport and the transfer of technical solutions, of tools, etc., of technology, but we have to make sure that the knowledge is being built that is relevant to carry out these do your city by your own hands, do your environment by your own hands approach. And I would hold that technically and technologically we have quite advanced already. We have good co-design, urban co-design methodologies. There are platforms, digital tools that help people shape and co-design and co-plan their urban environment. I think the open issue at the moment is still more on the legal side and on the regulatory side. So how about the management of the responsibility? Think of failed structures. There is something like dangerous planning. Not all the planning that is done by good intention comes out as a good planning result. And these kind of responsibility and quality management issues in local-based, community-based planning and constructions, they still need to be addressed.
Okay. Great, thank you. So some detailed responses. Any other comments or questions from the audience? I know that we've moved through a lot of the conversation here. So did you, okay. Did you want to follow up? Sure.
Yeah, maybe just to add a few points. I mean, when we talk about, for instance, when I think about Upper Egypt with the heat islands, where we expect children to still continue to go to school while the temperature is at 40 or 45 degrees, it's barely impossible. And I gave myself a challenge to travel to Upper Egypt in the second half of May. This is a very hot period, and made a comparison between, being in the building that is built with this world architecture, to see how it feels inside those buildings, as compared to the kind of modern buildings we are sort of, promoting throughout. The level at which we are leveraging on this world architecture and this traditional knowledge which is available in terms of construction and so on is so tiny. So that's what I'm talking about when it comes to commodification. and also valorization of the kind of patrimony which is there in terms of construction and building. But also, on the other hand, we are talking about increasing people's resilience to save human lives, because at the end of the day, we're talking about human lives. When you take the Delta, the way people actually handle plastic waste, for instance, it's clogging the gutters. And in the instance where you have places with high, the rising water level in the Delta and clogged drains, it actually makes it impossible to react on time, because actually the floods that happen, I mean, it endangers people, it endangers properties and so on. So through the mass education, I think, amongst people to understand the patterns of causality, in behaving the way they behave, for instance, with waste, it can be something that can actually take many lives away from them. So what I'm talking about is really the mass education that is impossible, and the planners, we know the causality, patterns of causality between certain phenomena and so on. We can engage in mass education and make sure that simple things help people to get together and save lives in the event of disasters and so on. So these two aspects, valorizing traditional architecture, local knowledge, and so on, but also on the other hand, the resilience, the level of responsiveness of communities whenever they are facing difficulties, and these are the two aspects I wanted to really highlight here as an important point.
Thank you so much. That sort of brings up so many threads that have been brought up in the conversation. Does anybody want to respond to those issues?
Yeah, just to maybe, I think it's two very important points. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the traditional architecture. I think there's others on the panel which could talk to that point more or better than I can. But the resilience, the community resilience, maybe just a couple of thoughts to that one. I think what in many cities also that Frauke Graas has talked about and so forth, the challenges are so great or so large that really what we need to be talking about is really a distribution and sort of a social contract on who in the society takes which part between state, non-state, civil society and so forth. But I think it's very dangerous I think it's good on the one hand side to talk about the resilience at community level and so forth, and to focus on community measures and so forth. And I think Frauke has shown, based on empirical results also, how well some communities can cope in the first hours after disasters and so forth. At the same time, oftentimes that argument, in my view, is being extended too extreme. Because if we say community resilience, what we clearly see in the literature, there's also certain limits to community resilience. If you think a larger scale, if you think about more long-term reconstruction processes and so forth. And if the sort of the celebration of community resilience means accepting that in certain contexts, for instance, we are no longer putting any hope in things like public social security systems and public social support, then that is driving that argument a little bit too far. No? And so I think that's the interesting discussion for the future. There's so many additional challenges that come towards or on top of the general agenda in cities that really a very open and explicit debate needs to be starting, which we don't have in many contexts around the globe yet, not in Germany, not in many other parts. How do we actually want to share the responsibility within a society, and how do we want to support particularly the most vulnerable? We have this also in Germany bubbling up a little bit after extreme events. Then that debate is there for 2 weeks, but we don't have a very strategic debate on that point in the times of the disasters, when we should actually sit down and discuss these things. I think that is a key challenge. So yes, let's cherish community resilience, but let's not sort of leave others off the hook by doing so.
I want to jump from that to Jorn, your discussion, and maybe I think is relevant to your point, the experience that you've had post-floods in Germany and the climate resilient development, this notion of a window of opportunity. Because, I mean, of course, we've heard these great challenges in the everyday and the experience, and how do we move forward? And to Matthias's point, that maybe there are these sort of strategic opportunities for windows of to take action, windows of opportunity post-extreme event. How do you feel that is playing out in the case study in a very highly developed context? And is there any transferability to other contexts? Or what are the messages that come out of that?
Yeah, quite complex question, but I try to to answer it briefly. I think the good point is that normally the Germans are seen as quite strict, but also the Reconstruction Fund and the regulation behind the Reconstruction Fund has changed. And this is probably also a good sign. So actually also with loss and damage programs, I would suggest that if we have the new funding schemes, for example, for urban adaptation, it would make a lot of sense on the one hand to prioritize certain actions and funding streams first. But for example, if we then see that the cooperation between certain municipalities or cities along a watershed, what Seth also said, is not sufficiently taking place, then the level of funding should be increased. I mean, normally we have this very traditional funding scheme also for conference or hotel booking. You pay a price for very specific things, for whatever train infrastructure, for a new house or road system, and you have a percentage of funding. But I think we have to modify this. We have to look more into functional solution spaces, not saying, okay, we build this infrastructure and you get 50 or 70% funding, be it from the World Bank, be it from the state of Rhine-Palatinate or the federal government, or for example, after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, we have to then say, okay, what are then additional incentives we want to provide with funding? And here I think the funding rate should actually then consider, for example, the quality of a proposal. Why should we always define the level of whatever typology of infrastructures that receive a certain funding level? Why we're not asking for a good proposal, and then a good proposal receives 80 or 90% of funding, or maybe 100% if it's a country which cannot afford the rest of the 10%, but another one would probably receive 60%. I think here also the innovation in mechanisms that really steer process is important. It doesn't make too much sense to have too many consultants drawing plans if the regulations behind funding, or what also Jörg said in terms of real legal regulations, don't change. Maybe one short example, I think it's also actually relevant for parts in Egypt. If you have a damaged house, be it from a flood or from a coastal storm, and you rebuild it in the same manner, you don't need a new building permit. If you want to change your house in Alexandria and you modify it, you need a building permit. And suddenly then the entire new regulations apply. And this is also a mismatch. For example, if you talk about incentives to build resilience, I think that here, temporal standards or more incentives are needed. It's not sufficient if we have a nice guidebook and a nice tutorial for YouTube. You need the actual drivers of certain processes. And that is, in some cases, funding, in some cases, laws, in some other social networks. So here we have to be more strategic. And my feeling is we have to get away a bit from the standardization. I mean, probably it's in the line of what the Egyptian colleagues said, but we have still the tendency to look into also, be it in Vietnam or in Germany, we have certain infrastructures that get a certain funding rate. Doesn't matter what kind of concept is behind it. It's a type of infrastructure that gets a specific funding rate. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Does anyone else want to pick up on some of these threads that have been brought out in the conversation? I think it's very compelling in terms of thinking about these potential solution spaces, but all the barriers that come up, as well as some of the enabling conditions. Frauke, please.
Yeah, if I may, that's a great discussion, Bill. Let me add on what Matthias and Jan said, how to share the responsibility, and we do not have a strategic debate. I mean, we are very much talking about, I would say, discussion culture-oriented ways of perceiving it. But how about different political, societal, and cultural systems? The priorities are very different. There are different ways of reporting, expert exchange, and public discussion, let alone adequate governance. I mean, in many countries, whatever gets to risks is on taboos, and people do not like to talk about it, let alone think or act in that direction. And as far as I see it, we do not yet have a strategic debate for those countries and societies in which we have, from our perspectives, deficits in terms of political priorities towards those topics. So how to deal with that? And I think it is more than timely to think about adequate governance, ways of debate, and inclusion of those debates into all kinds of public and societal priorities.
Yeah, Bill.
Yep.
Just I love where Franca, is that how I?
Okay.
Yeah, I loved the comments where you were just going with that, and I hope I pronounced your name right. I think going back to the prompt from our colleague from GIZ, who's been your comments have been fantastic. To maybe put a different wrapper on everything that's just been said about, which I fully agree with. We need to stop thinking about infrastructure in terms of what it is, and we need to start thinking about it in terms of what it does. And if we start communicating to people, we're not building a bridge, we're actually building a mechanism which allows these two communities to connect to each other. We're allowing supply chains, we're allowing a mechanism for egress in terms of a catastrophe or a hazard. It completely changes the rationale, the explanation, and the participation with which you were doing that. The example you were giving about drains and flooding, that also has everything to do with awareness, education, and Franca again was making comments in her presentation about SMEs and why SMEs are so important in local communities. Well, so are people. And we keep forgetting that infrastructure doesn't work without people, both to build it, maintain it, operate it, but also to use it. And if you have a conversation and if you do proper community engagement and stakeholder engagement, you might find out from that community that their biggest priority isn't flooding. They might not care about the flooding. They might want cleaner air and access to energy. So you actually have the reverse happening. You have a local community who's ticked off that somebody came in, spent a bunch of money, ripped up the sidewalks, put in a bunch of drains that they didn't ask for, and they might intentionally be clogging them. So how we engage this, how we talk about this is absolutely vital to getting the buy-in, the engagement, but also the maintenance of the community, the care, the long-term prioritization, and the political buy-in from those local stakeholders on doing the project in the first place.
So let me pick up from that. A clap from the audience. Excellent. A double thumbs up. Do you want to add a comment into this conversation? Or if you move a bodily tick in the audience, you're going to be asked to see if you want to.
I didn't know I would be speaking, but I mean, what you said really caught my attention. I do a lot of equitable community engagement work, and all of these cities say that they're so ready for climate action and doing all this work, but have you consulted with the community? You know, ultimately, a lot of times we've gone from informing the community, and we need to instead be deferring to community because ultimately they're the experts here. You know, they know what's best for their community. And I've seen people say, we put these toilets in this community and they're not using it. It's like, well, did you ask them? Did you look at the cultural norms? And so I was just resonating with what you were saying, and appreciate you having this space and saying that.
Great. Thanks for the comment. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have a question.
Sure, please.
In the question of transfer of technology and energy.
Could you speak a little closer to the mic? Thank you.
Energy. By the way, I'm Angelius Michael. I'm from India. Where is the space for indigenous knowledge? And do science and technology undermine the indigenous knowledge? And when we talk about transfer and sharing of technology and resources, are we talking an inclusive in the inclusive line, or we are excluding that indigenous part of it? And my second question is about climate-induced migration, where we see that it is referring to the people who are internally displaced. So when people are internally displaced, it is not much talked about, because they are inside the country. So how do the technology and science contribute to this particular community who repeatedly get deprived of some of the basic rights? Thank you.
Great, thanks. So you've brought up another question which you haven't touched on. Maybe we'll get this other one. We're coming up against the half hour, but please.
Hello, Prantak Mitra from India. My question is mostly about the financial gaps and how to mitigate them, both in terms of developing the investment and also what these private sector investment takes into account in lights of, like this gentleman mentioned about the internal migration, as well as about the communities to provide them with affordable financial options to actually afford for, say, something like a renewable energy option for their energy accessibility. Mostly in the context of developing smart cities across the globe, mostly in the south, the economic south.
Okay, great, thanks. So we're going to be ending on the half hour. So we have 5 panelists. I'm going to give each one 1 minute. Is that correct? Yes, I got to. So who wants to go first? So what I'd like you to do is to respond to the gentleman's questions and sort of say anything else you want to say in that 1 minute. So we're a speed round. Who wants to go first? We've been going to the stage first. We'll go to the virtual first. Who would like to go first? Frauke, I'm looking at you first. Yeah, or do you have, if no immediate response to the question, how would you like to sort of say last thoughts to the audience? But I'm going to stop you in a minute.
Don't worry. I like very much the issue of migration and IDPs. It holds true that they add upon the already very diverse urban setting, urban population groups. And I must say, this is where we really have to focus on in the future, diversity, multiplicities of different arrangements in cities.
Perfect, thanks. That was less than 1 minute, but it's all good. How about Jorn?
Connecting to the
Jörg.
yeah,
Jörg or Jorn, whichever one. Jörg, how about you
the
first?
Jörg with the G at the end.
The G,
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
All
All right. Just adding to what Frauke Kass just mentioned, I think the issues of migration management, of migrants integration, and the anticipation what happens actually in terms of migrant flows between countries, but also within countries. Large countries like India have a huge internal migration. This isn't well mapped so far, as to my knowledge, to urban development, and to have a migrant management, migrant integration management connected to an integrated urban development is an issue that still needs to be picked up, be modeled, be supplied by adequate instruments. So that there's something to do, and I think we should put this on the agenda for the next COP and the IPC.
Yeah. As well as the report, the special report on cities. But it's a great point. Jorn, with the N.
Yeah, maybe also this point about science and technology, smart cities versus indigenous knowledge. To be honest, I think we have not heavily linked these two things. I mean, often the technology and smart city debate is tentatively not integrating too much indigenous knowledge. And I think here it would be also helpful if we actually better combine different methods that would allow us to combine this knowledge in certain parts of smart city concepts, or vice versa. Actually, if you talk about risk models, I think we are often tentatively use large physical models or look at urban heat fluxes, but we are not considering this is different types of knowledge, like indigenous knowledge. I think that it could be also kind of research gap that needs to be addressed in the future. To what extent can we complement knowledge, and to what extent are these also competing knowledge parts? Thanks.
Yeah. Excellent. All hands on deck in terms of knowledge, but the connection between the smart city kind of logic and the indigenous knowledge, I don't know that literature well, but I don't think those contact points have been made to a large extent. So that's an interesting observation. Okay, gentlemen, you have the last minute each.
Well, I'll jump in. There was a couple of big questions there.
Yes.
I'm going to go at the indigenous knowledge intersection of innovation and technology. And is that a perverse relationship of something that doesn't exist? I would definitely fall that it hasn't really been explored. And to date, innovation and technology has usually exacerbated the issues and the separation of indigenous communities. I'm seeing a little bit of an about face in that area, which is very, very exciting. So as an example, there's some amazing work that's happening in indigenous communities in Canada. And because of the land rights that some hard-fought processes from indigenous communities have received, they're now beginning to, again, they're some of the last people to get some infrastructure in terms of water, energy. But what they're doing now is using their own sovereign rights and land to start piloting innovation and innovative technologies to develop their own services, kind of multi-services utility companies, kind of Muscos. They're independent co-ops that they're setting up. They're attracting investment because the technology and investment want to pilot things. They're able to do that quickly with various indigenous communities to get that up and running. And the indigenous communities are having independence and kind of gaining control and providing basic services for what they need. So I'm seeing actually all of a sudden a very positive relationship there, and one that's both empowering and providing implementation and knowledge that can be expanded.
Excellent. So we started with Mateus. We're going to end with Mateus.
We started with you.
Well,
You're gonna end.
real content was you. You go.
But I'll also pick up on the knowledge point. I think it's increasingly. I mean, it always has been important. It has not really been used to the extent that it should have, and I think we should really pick that up. Why? Because we need to think about adaptation, alternatives, risk management. The challenges are so great. I think that has been coming through all the presentations. But what are we doing currently when we try to evaluate different quote-unquote options that we have? By and large, we still go for cost-benefit analysis, environmental impact assessment, and so forth. What we don't understand very well is things like social acceptance, feasibility, political feasibility, irreversibility of things, and so forth. And that really needs to come to the fore. Particularly also, we haven't spoken about that one, but I just chip it in. We still have sort of, when we talk to city planners and to urban folk, that sort of notion, if we now do adaptation right, we can't really get mitigation right, but if we do adaptation right, we'll be able to somehow protect the cities as we used to know them. That is a very risky thought, I think. We start to have to think about our limits of adaptation and the losses that we will encounter. And also here, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and how we deal with those. What is actually really close to our hearts? What do we really want to protect? Where do we want to prioritize? Is, I think, increasingly an important part of the debate. We are just starting to unpack that and to realize that as society, I think, across the globe, actually. That will be a very harmful or very painful process. And here we really need local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, quite a bit.
Great. So that's, I think, a perfect way to end the discussion. We're a little bit over, but thank you all for the comments. Thank the audience, of course, the virtual audience as well. I think we've covered a lot of territory. This is obviously a long discussion that's evolving. As I started the conversation, this is our moment in terms of the urban focus, right? We're coming up against this idea of a special report. We've had the SUP, the summary for urban policymakers, which has just come out. There's a lot of work in this space. So for all of us, we need to sort of kind of combine our interests and sort of move the whole discussion forward. And we're doing that in these sessions. You have a session on Wednesday. What time again?
It's at 9 a.m.
9 a.m. So look for your guidebook for that. Thank you all, and thanks to the organizers for this event, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you.